Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today we have the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Dmitry Taubinsky. Dmitry is an associate professor in the Department of Economics here at UC Berkeley. Prior to joining us here, he completed his postdoctoral fellowships at Harvard University and also UC Berkeley, and received his PhD in economics from Harvard University. Additionally, he is a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, a co-editor at the Journal of Public Economics, and a member of the board of editors of the American Economic Journal, Economic Policy. He conducts research in behavioral and public economics and their intersection using a combination of theory, field experiments, surveys, and quasi-experiments. He studies topics including inattention to and misunderstanding of tax incentives, syntaxes, consumer-facing energy policy and regulation, welfare effects of non-standard policy levers, and financial decision-making by low-income populations. He has received numerous awards, grants, and fellowships, including many Excellence in Refereeing Awards and an Alfred P. Sloan Research Grant. Today, Dmitry will share with us his work on welfare and the act of choosing. Please join me in welcoming Dmitry.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you so much for having me here. So apologies for the delay in the setup. I'm very excited to chat with you about some of the recent work that I've been doing that built on ongoing work at the intersection of behavioral economics and public economics, in particular applying tools of behavioral economics to better understand policies. So let me just start with a little bit of an overview to kind of give you a sense of what motivated the specific paper I'll spend most of the time talking about today. But let me just give you a little bit of a backdrop of this whole area of research around applying behavioral economics to public policy. So much of the concern in this fairly recent area of research is how can we move beyond what economists call the revealed preference approach in a disciplined way? Okay. What do I mean by the revealed preference approach? Well, the revealed preference approach, when we're evaluating policies or trying to make statements about welfare, says that, if we want to learn if a piece of chocolate or an apple is better for someone, let's just watch what this person chooses. Whatever this person chooses must be what's best for them. And it's a powerful approach in the following sense. It gives you a very transparent link from data that you can just go out and observe in the world to making statements about how well off or how much worse off will people be if we institute this or that tax or this or that ban and so forth. So for instance, if we observe a lot of price variation, and this data shows that, well, I'm willing to pay up to $2.50 for a bottle of soda pop, then we go out and we measure production costs. Well, it costs about 50 cents to produce this bottle of soda pop. We think about other external effects. For example, if I keep drinking soda pop, I'm more likely to develop diabetes and cardiovascular health problems, and that's going to have a negative external burden on the health system. And then you can kind of put it together. It's worth $2.50 to me, and it costs 50 cents plus $1 of external damages. So altogether, there's a social surplus of $1 that results from my purchase. If you ban it, what did we learn? Well, the negative welfare effect is going to be $1 per bottle. Okay? So you can see how it's very powerful. You don't have to learn why I value the bottle of soda pop for $2.50. You don't have to figure out if it's because I love the polar bear commercials that Coca-Cola had during my childhood, or if I just really like the taste, if I just like something about the carbonation and so forth. All you have to know is that I'm willing to pay up to $2.50 for it. It's also obvious that the assumptions that would validate this kind of approach are wrong. I think it's pretty obvious. I don't think that's anyone with just even a little bit of a semblance of a theory of mind or some introspection would say, well, wow, there's a lot of different assumptions that are going into this kind of approach to welfare measurement. Now, kind of as a popular aphorism goes, all models are wrong, some are useful. And so the question is, given these challenges, can we do better? And again, for me, the relevant question is, not can we have a perfect approach, but can we do better than this approach while, again, maintaining the kind of simplicity and direct link between real-world data and the types of claims we are able to make. Okay? And so what I've been concerned with, as well as many other behavioral economists, particularly the ones who are interested in making statements about policy, is how can we improve on this kind of approach given these two classes of challenges? And by the way, if you have other challenges, please tell me. It just means that there will be more interesting papers to write. But I kind of see two types of challenges. One is, a pretty obvious one, which is, well, people do all sorts of things for the wrong reasons, at least some of the time. I actually don't think it's quite as prevalent as sometimes it's made out to be. I think at the end of the day, we are kind of the best judge of our own well-being, but we're obviously not infallible. Okay, so, in this particular example, why would this be a wrong conclusion about the welfare effects of the ban? Well, maybe I value soda as much as I do, just because I don't actually understand how all of that sugar, or whatever, is actually going to impact my health. If I don't have an appropriate understanding of that, in particular, if I think it's nowhere near as bad as it actually is, of course I'm going to overvalue it. Or I might understand that it's kind of bad for me, but I might have lapses of self-control. And we might think that these lapses of self-control, just like incorrect beliefs, are kind of like a form of characterization failure and kind of like a mistake that shouldn't really factor into what might be my normative willingness to pay for this bottle of soda pop. Okay? That's class number one. Class number two of challenges, and this is the one, this is what most of today's talk is going to be about, and what the current paper is about, is what if the act of choosing itself is generating welfare-relevant sensations? If you put a bottle of soda pop in front of me, I might just be so tempted to have it. And I'm just going to say, I cannot resist this temptation. If I don't get this bottle of soda pop, I'm going to feel terrible. So I have a very high willingness to pay for it. But if a policymaker is then trying to use this willingness to pay to figure out what would be the consequences of a ban, it would be wrong for them to use the willingness to pay that I exhibit when this bottle of soda pop is in front of me. Because if it was banned, I would no longer experience the temptation, and I would no longer have that kind of a willingness to pay for a bottle of soda pop. And again, I'll explain this in much more detail, but this is kind of what Doug Burnham and I have been calling the non-comparability problem. Okay, which is my choices are fundamentally non-comparable to the kinds of policies and choices that policymakers and regulators have. Okay, so what are some paths forward given these kinds of challenges? This is kind of tongue-in-cheek, but also kind of realistic, because different people have exhibited different versions of these paths forward. One path forward is to say, well, you know what, revealed preference assumptions are stupid, and in fact, people make so many mistakes and do so many complicated things that I'm just not going to bother trying to make meaningful statements about real-world policy. Or you might say, if you're kind of, the older generation of kind of Chicago school-style economists, you might say, well, see, that's what happens when you start bringing in psychology. You open up a Pandora's box. We used to have, something very parsimonious and very transparent, and now who knows what's going to happen. Let's just stick to revealed preference. That's, of course, also a logical fallacy, because just because something is complicated doesn't mean your best model is to ignore it. So that's kind of one thing. I don't find that satisfying. There's a second thing, and I also hear that more often than I would have expected to hear, which is, let's just give up on using data and say, well, soda is bad for people. We know what's best for people. We can judge what people should be doing without even seeing any data on their preferences or beliefs. I also find that extreme form of paternalism quite unsatisfying. There's also a third approach, which I also hear more often than I would have expected, which is, let's forget talking about any kind of holistic sense of well-being and just focus on something extremely narrow, like population health. But that doesn't really make sense, because if all we really wanted to do is maximize population health, we would basically have to ban anything that tastes good. And and when you think about that, that can't possibly be the right policy, but that is the logical implication of saying all we care about is population health. Clearly there are trade-offs between experiencing the taste of something and enjoying something and the kind of downstream health costs that it might have. Yes, please.
And wondering if another challenge could be how willingness to pay is elicited, if that might change willingness to pay. I'm just curious how you're thinking about this.
Oh yeah, and there's of course a lot of methodological work on this. I struggle with this question, every time I try to put together one of these measures.
I think some people didn't hear my question.
Can you repeat?
Oh yeah, the question is, another challenge is, how do we elicit willingness to pay? Yeah, and I was saying, of course, there's been decades of methodological work on the best way of doing that. Multiple price lists, Becker-DeGroot-Marshak mechanisms. That's absolutely, it's a very important methodological challenge. I would put this in a slightly different bucket. It's not a challenge to revealed preferences approaches per se. It's kind of a challenge a little bit towards what's the right method of elicitation, in general. Because willingness to pay elicitations also matter even if you're not going, by the standard book approach of revealed preferences. Okay, and so this area of behavioral public economics, which Doug and I review, and we'll probably have another review at some point, given how much progress has been made since 2018, the goal of this area of work is really to kind of, again, as I was saying, do something better than revealed preference while still maintaining, kind of like the discipline and the transparent links between data and measures of well-being. Yes?
This might be tangential, so just ignore it if it is. But you sort of frame this as revealed preferences as, bring something to another, and there's this literature on preference reversal.
Yep.
That, if you rate things separately, you might have a different preference than if you saw them simultaneously. In your example, you're offering something versus nothing, right? As opposed to soda versus coffee. Does that matter in your paradigm, or is that in the wind, kind of?
Yeah, so I think you're right. So I think a precondition for us to even start talking about revealed preferences is that people have to have a stable and complete ordering. So it's not even, so we can't have preference reversals, number one. Number two, people have to have complete preferences. You can't have someone say, I don't know, which in reality of course does happen. So you're absolutely right. And so in fact, the way I often, if I'm in an audience of combative economists, the way I often start the talks is to say, look, I know you all love revealed preference, but here's the data. In one condition, this is the demand curve that you get. In another condition, this is the demand curve that you get. So let's just start there. We have two different demand curves, and what are we going to do now? And that's a great way to kind of motivate why we need to have different approaches. Absolutely. So, okay, so I think the main thing I just want to say is, so there's been a lot of progress on challenge one. This is the one I think behavioral economists are kind of naturally drawn to, and everyone wants to kind of work on this. There's been a lot less progress on challenge two, which is today's, again, going to be the main topic we're going to talk about today. So for the rest of this, let me do this. I just kind of want to give you a 15-minute overview of the progress that's been made in this area, just to kind of give you a sense of this research area of behavioral economics and policy, so you can kind of see where we're coming from when we're writing this paper, which is really just kind of like a first installment in what we hope will be, hopefully a much larger and better area of research. This is just going to be the first step to kind of orient the profession a little bit more towards also thinking about challenge number 2. Okay, so let me give you an overview. So here's one where I think there's been a lot of discussion. Energy efficiency. So this is the 2010, you're not going to hear something like this from the EPA today. This is the 2010 EPA. They must have had a behavioral scientist there at the time or something, saying, why should we try to subsidize more energy efficient products and potentially try to phase out the less energy efficient one? Well, people don't really appreciate the benefits of having a more fuel efficient car, of having a more energy efficient light bulb or other kind of appliance. Why? Well, people might be myopic, they might be misinformed, and they might just be kind of inattentive because the benefits, they're little benefits dispersed over time. Every day you just accrue just a tiny bit of extra savings from a more energy efficient appliance. It's not going to be as salient as the difference in upfront prices that's right in front of you and kind of like screaming at you, hey, the more energy efficient product looks scarily more expensive. Okay, so what did we do there? These are just going to be brief summaries. So Hunt and I thought about the light bulb market in this particular debate, and at the time there was a lot of discussion of phasing out and then completely banning incandescent light bulbs. This was pre-LEDs, so we're actually talking about incandescents versus CFLs in this paper. And as I was just saying, I love to start talks by saying, there isn't actually one demand curve. I know you all know what to do when you have one demand curve and how to analyze tax policy with a single demand curve. This is a case where we really ought to be talking about 2. So what we did is we basically observed how people's relative preference for CFLs versus incandescents at different relative prices, both in like the baseline condition, and in a condition where we basically try to induce knowledge and attention to kind of mitigate these kinds of concerns. Did we do it perfectly? Probably not. But basically what we did is we said, look, here are 2 packages. If you start including not just upfront prices, but also the total savings that accrue, over a particular time period, here's how much a package of incandescents will really cost you to fill a socket, and here's how much it'll really cost you to fill a socket with CFLs. So we're just making it very easy and transparent. And then, we're not trying to assume what's good for people. We're just trying to discover. This is the blue demand curve. That's the treated population. We're trying to discover what people's preferences look like when they are fully attentive and fully knowledgeable, and when we don't have to worry about the complexities of adding up different types of components of price, influencing their decision making, in particular, inducing mistakes. Once you have these 2 demand curves, without kind of going into the technicalities, you can kind of say, well, look, if you just applied standard efficiency cost formulas that we've had in economics since Arnold Harberger in the 1960s, it would be this red. Taxes are distortionary, in competitive markets where consumers are already making good decisions. This would be the red. But what we just discovered is that there's a big difference between how people normally choose and how they would choose if the consequences of their actions were fully transparent to them. That's the blue demand curve. The wedge between these demand curves is kind of the policy relevant measure of what a mistake is in this context. And once you take into account this policy relevant measure of a mistake, and in particular the sense in which a subsidy effectively counteracts this mistake, a subsidy for more energy efficient appliances, you have to compare this blue. These are the gains from the behavior change, where we're better aligning people's behavior with what they should really be doing. You start seeing that, no, taxes and subsidies are not distortionary in this particular case. The optimal subsidy per package of CFLs would be about $3, but it's not like people are completely crazy and they're always making mistakes. It's actually kind of a very moderate conclusion that we reached here. People are also valuing, there's enough other value from the less efficient light bulbs. For example, at the time, CFLs were super annoying because they take time to warm up. People don't like that they have mercury and so forth, that if you actually ban them, that would actually be too extreme of a policy. So we need some alignment, but not something as extreme as a ban. Yeah, meantime.
How are you dealing with demand effects here? So is there something in the control that goes with the fact that
Yeah.
attention and knowledge are also nudging them?
Perfect. Yeah. So there were two things that's exactly the kind of the biggest concern about this methodology. So one is that's why there are actually two type of treatment demand curves here. Because the way the experiment was run is people made a bunch of choices, and then they either had control group information or treatment group information, and then they made choices again. And so then and the reason we did it that way is because we also needed to understand exactly how these wedges align by people's baseline willingness to pay. So you really needed that kind of within-person design. But now, whenever you have a within-person design, the first thing you might worry about is, well, either there could be a demand effect from people having to choose again after seeing some information, or there could be anchoring, and maybe we're actually underestimating the treatment effect. So that's why we had a group where they didn't choose before seeing the treatment or control screens. They just saw the information and then they chose. So that was number one, and here they're almost perfectly aligned. Number two, we took one of these social desirability scales from psychology to kind of understand, try to partition people into ones who might be more or less susceptible to experiment or demand effects, and we interacted that with our estimated treatment effects, and that was a very precisely estimated null. So does that fully deal with demand effects? Probably not, but but I feel much more comfortable. I felt more comfortable ex post than ex ante after these kinds of tests. Okay, back to soda. To give you another example. So here, soda taxes. Lots of discussion of soda taxes. Some U.S. cities have them. That actually underrepresents how popular soda taxes are all over the world. Many countries have soda taxes these days. And part of the motivation for soda taxes is just something like external health damages. It's a burden on the health system. Another source of motivation that you often see in public debates is that, well, people just don't even really know what's good for them. And this again comes back to lapses of self-control or incorrect beliefs. You see a lot of suggestive evidence for this in the data. So what we did here is there's this amazing data set that's created by Nielsen at the University of Chicago, where you basically get to see everything people purchase. That's Nielsen home scan. So every time you purchase a bag of groceries, that all gets scanned in, and you have data at the universal product code level, at the UPC level, at the barcode level here. And then what's really cool is you can take this, and this is years and years of data per household of everything they purchase. You can also run surveys and experiments and match it back to the scanner data. So one of the things we did here is we elicited people's nutrition knowledge using the popular questionnaire from Public Health. I think it was about something like 50 questions here. And we also elicited people's self-control when it comes to, particularly in the sugary drinks domain. What you can see is that levels of nutrition knowledge are worryingly, extremely negatively correlated with sugary drinks consumption. To the point that people kind of in the lowest decile, these are bin scatter plots, so these are deciles, these are bins of 10% each. People in the lowest decile consume basically twice as much soda per household member as people in the top decile, which is where the nutritionists and we had, I think 24 nutritionists and dietitians in our city, because again, it's a 20,000 sample, so we actually know in sample how the most nutritionally literate people score on this test. It's a very strong. This is completely unconditioned. It's just a correlation. So let's not make any causal claims here, but it's very suggestive of these kinds of issues, and similarly strong correlation with measures of self-control. Yes?
What happens if you partial out poverty?
You mean if you control for income?
Sure. The deeper question though is there's a sense that nutrition knowledge and self-control are under your it's like your prerogative or your whereas something like poverty, it's a condition that you may not have a lot of control over.
Yeah, well, okay, so I can give you a direct answer, which is these relationships stay just about as negative and extreme when you fully control for income. You know, not just, you know, poverty is in there because you basically just control non-parametrically for deciles of income. So the lowest one would be people in poverty, but more generally you can control for income as carefully as you want, and you basically get these kinds of relationships. And now we're kind of moving more toward conditional correlations. The other thing you might think about is, well, how do all of these things vary with people's tastes or people's concerns for their health? We elicited all of that as well. So you can control for it. So we literally very detailed elicitations of how much do you like this or that drink, how much do you care about your health, because and all of those things you might also imagine vary by income as well. So you can control for all of that. And you know, these relationships get somewhat more attenuated, but really not that much. So there's really, it seems like there are raw, very strong conditional relationships between these measures of potential problems and people's consumption. And income is something we're very concerned about because one of the debates in this sugary drinks tax world has always been about regressivity. You know, so, you know, there were a lot of advocates saying, well, they're good for people's health. You know, then there were politicians like Bernie Sanders, you know, he was campaigning in Philadelphia at the time that it was considering the sugary drinks tax, and he's saying, we need to get rid of this totally regressive tax because, you know, I'm not showing this figure to you here, but it's also true that sugary drinks consumption declines very radically and steeply with income. And it's not even just people in poverty versus not, it's really just across the whole income distribution. It's a very negative gradient between sugary drinks consumption and income, and so this is the sense in which taxes are regressive. Who's going to be paying more sugary drinks tax if it's instituted? Well, it has to be the low-income people who are consuming more soda. But here's the catch. There's an important subtlety that we get from kind of behavioral economics techniques that both consider the regressivity, but also think about distortions to people's decision-making. So when we put these kinds of facts and some of the other ones I mentioned together to get something closer to like an actual measure of overconsumption by sugary drinks, here what we're able to construct is basically a monetary measure of overconsumption of sugary drinks in the following sense: by how much do people overestimate the value of an ounce, you know, per ounce of soda. Okay, and the reason we're putting it in monetary terms here is not just because we're economists, but because it's a very complex policy debate. It's not just about people's mistakes, as I was saying, it's also about external damages and burdens on the health system. Those we always measure in money terms. It's also about questions about regressivity, which is the incidence of this tax. You know, are we going to be in the situation where low-income people pay $100 per year of sugary drink tax and high-income people pay $30? All of these other statistics that people care about are money terms. So we have to put mistakes in money terms as well. And these are the estimates that we put together after you take into account both the lapses of self-control and correct beliefs. And so on average, about 1 cent per ounce overestimation of the value of soda. But you see that also has a reasonably steep gradient with income. Higher income people overestimate less than lower income people, in part because they actually have much higher levels of nutritional literacy. And so, yes, please.
Well, it seems to me one interesting aspect of this is that the tax could presumably have a substantially greater effect on how much low-income people consume.
Yeah, so that we tested that empirically. That's actually not true, surprisingly.
Really? Oh.
There's no difference in elasticities across the income distribution. Those are actually fairly homogeneous. But again, what's heterogeneous is actually the overestimation. You know, we're basically, another way of saying it is, I think really what it's about is underestimation of the pernicious health consequences of sugary drinks consumption. And the reason this is really important, you know, and this is kind of where both kind of the behavioral science and the economics comes together, is that, you know, when you have politicians like Bernie Sanders saying, hey, it's regressive, it's partly true, but it's also missing an important part of the picture, because what do taxes do? Taxes change behavior. And if low-income people overestimate the value of sugary drinks more, meaning they're making the biggest mistake, it means that the behavior change produced by the tax is actually very progressive. So the mechanical financial burden is regressive, but the behavior change is progressive. And when you kind of put these things together, in a kind of a formal model that kind of assigns appropriate weights to all of these different effects, you actually find that, all in all, there's no income group in the population, including people in poverty, who would actually be on average hurt by this sugary drinks tax. And you can kind of make calculations about what does the optimal tax look like, and so forth. Yes?
Could you say one more time or give a couple more sentences on how you calculate the overestimation?
Okay, oh yeah, well, I actually didn't say my, okay, so let me, okay, there's a number of components. So the first thing you want to do is you want to just say, due to factors like these, in just percent terms, how much more soda do people consume? So if we basically gave everyone perfect self-control and the knowledge of nutritionists, how much less soda would people consume? And you want to do this conditionally on people's tastes, how much they care about health, and so forth. And so that we basically get from these types of questions in the scanner data, because we estimate models of how these things, again, conditionally, I'm not talking about unconditional correlations, but conditional on everything else that you think would affect sugary drinks consumption, how do these things relate? So then you form a prediction about how much less people would consume if they were all at this point, and at this point. Okay, that's step one, but that just tells you in liters how much more they would consume. So how do you go to the money metric? Well, you need one more item here, which is you need to estimate how responsive people are to prices. So you estimate a price elasticity of demand. So you estimate, for example, when prices go up by 10%, demand drops by 10%. Okay? And this, and then there's a whole set of other estimation. How do you do that? Well, you have to be very careful. You basically look at exogenous shifters in prices. It's, you kind of utilize what economists and statisticians call the instrumental variables approach to construct an instrument for exogenous variation in prices, so you get an elasticity. And then how do you get to a money metric? Well, the intuition is like this. Let's say that we estimated that people would consume 20% less soda if they were at the optimal level of nutrition, knowledge, of self-control. We also estimate a price elasticity of demand of -1, meaning that when prices go up by 10%, soda consumption drops by 10%. Okay? Well, what that means is that what all of these biases are doing by causing kind of a 20% change in consumption is that means that they're equivalent to a 20% change in the price. And then if you know the market price, you multiply that by 20%, and that's exactly where these numbers come from. So it's actually kind of a combination of lots of different moments, and this last part, it's basically geometry. It's kind of like you have a triangle. The elasticity is the slope. You have the horizontal part, which is the quantity change in demand, and then you get the vertical part from the elasticity, which is the slope, and the horizontal part in overconsumption. That's kind of how it comes. Yeah, I'm skipping a lot of details right now, because, yes?
I'm not sure if I read your y-axis properly, but if you wouldn't mind going back a slide, it kind of looks to me like if you're looking at, if you did like top quartile, bottom quartile, that you might say that self-control is a more powerful determinant of how much you drink sugary drinks than nutritional knowledge. It looks to me that the top to the bottom is 80 versus 40 or 50 or something. I'm not sure if I'm reading that right, but then I started wondering, if that were right, how does a Chicago economist deal with something like, well, you could teach people, more about nutrition, but
Yeah.
how do you manipulate self-control, which seems like more in the realm of what we do in our clinics and things like that?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a great question. I think the issue you're bringing up that I'm not really going to touch much on today is kind of choice of policy instrument. Another way to take your question is, all I'm doing here is estimating optimal taxes. And why am I doing that? Well, in some sense, because that's kind of the real world policy that, that's the most prevalent one. Is that the optimal choice of instrument? Well, not necessarily. Perhaps some kind of knowledge induction or attention manipulation could do better, because the thing about a tax is it's a totally blunt policy instrument. A tax is going to affect people here whose behavior you don't really want to change, and it's going to affect people here whose behavior you do want to change. So it's blunt, and it's inefficient for that reason. It's affecting everyone's behavior, not just the people we want to target. In theory, information induction or, things that people kind of refer to as nudges could be more efficient. In practice, I have a paper showing that it's not that. Because, how do you actually come to be, at least many versions of the kind of nudges that folks in the public health space have entertained, because how do you get to be a person here? Basically by ignoring information that people throw at you. And if you're that kind of a person, why would we as researchers think that slapping on like an additional label on a bottle of sugary drinks is actually going to hit these people? It's very likely not going to be, because these people got to be here exactly by ignoring all of the kinds of nudges and other sources of information that we might consider throwing. So it's in principle a useful policy instrument. In practice, I think it's a very, it's an empirical question whether it is or not. Yeah.
How do you get around the problem that self-control can just be an ex post observation that we make about their own behavior? So what you want that to be, I think, in the way you described it, is control is an internal variable that's driving that theoretically. But if there's basically feedback to, well, here's my overall consumption, and that seems to be greater or less than sort of just circular, right?
Yeah, well, it's, I don't think circular is the word I would use. So yes, there's two problems with this, potential problems with this methodology. One is it's noisy. It's like there's, all sorts of different factors that can change how people respond. The retest reliability for these kinds of scales is around 0.6, which is, pretty good, but also if you're in the business of making predictions, it's not that good, because there's the standard attenuation issues when you have noisy right-hand side measures in your regressions. And then number two is the level effect, which is I might just be systematically overestimating my level of self-control, because like how much introspection do I really have? So how did we get around both of those things? We have a lot of households where there are two adult member households. So both partners are responding to this question. And so in fact we had multiple questions. We didn't just ask what's your level, we didn't just elicit your level of self-control, we elicited your perception of your spouse's level of self-control. And then there's another complementary literature that shows that we are much more aware and realistic about other self-control than we are of our own. And I think also anecdotally, I think our spouses are very well aware of all of our lapses of self-control. Amazingly, I was very pleasantly surprised by this, because we were prepared to use other techniques. They were actually very much lined up in levels. And then the retest reliability, one way of actually getting a very good measure of it is not kind of in the classical sense of over time responses, but actually taking the correlation of the two spouses. That's where, the assumptions about kind of classical measurement error are actually more likely to be true. Because you might think that the errors in reporting might actually themselves be correlated over time within a single person. They're actually more plausibly uncorrelated when you have elicitations from two separate people. And then you can make standard adjustments for the noisy part of the measure when you form these predictions. Basically, one spouse's response is an instrument for the other spouse. So we're not kind of solving all of the deep issues, but on the kind of the realism levels issue and on the noisy part, that we basically address with, again, the double observation and kind of the statistical econometric methods that adjust for noise in right-hand side variables.
So let me follow up on that. It seems like for self-control, what you're always interested in getting is, what was my goal, and then how did I do relative to that? And it seems like the useful here is 15 apart. How did I do relative to it? Closely related, I think, not what probably to the variable you're measuring, or what the things you want to know is kind of central to that. What's the actual, are they trying to recognize? Right?
I didn't completely follow that. Okay, but let's talk more about that. I didn't completely follow that one. Okay, let me actually be mine, because I want to also, I'm actually kind of well into this. Let me quickly wrap up this summary. I'm going to skip the confusion about taxes. Let me just give you one more example, because I think this is a financial domain where I think the emotions elicitations that I'm going to talk about could be particularly relevant. The last example I want to give you is about payday lending markets, and that's been kind of one of the projects where I probably learned about the most. For those of you, which I hope is all of you, who've never taken out a payday loan, let me tell you how it works. The average size of a payday loan is about $300. And it's a subprime market that actually serves about a quarter to a third of the U.S. population. Because the bottom 25% of the U.S. population is, in terms of income, is very low income. So it's a subprime market, and the way it works is you go into a payday lender, you give them a post-dated check. It's dated to your next payday. And then again, that check, if you're taking out a loan for $300, the check you give them is for about $350. It's about, $15 to $20 in fees and interest on every $100. And again, when does it come due? When is that check going to be cashed by the payday lender? In about 2 to 3 weeks. So this is a 15 to 20% interest rate, not annualized, but for a 2 to 3 week loan. And then, that's not even the most worrying part of this market. The most worrying part of this market is that, what happens when that check is cashed? 80% of the time, this is a statistic in the data that we have, 80% of the time, the borrower is going to come back and they're going to take out exactly the same size loan again. 20% of the time they'll stop. About 80% of the time they will just take out a loan that's exactly the same size. So what that means is that people are actually in cycles of like 5 or 6 loans like that. And so what they end up paying back is about twice as much as what they borrowed, the principal they borrowed in the first place. So that's been a source of a lot of regulatory debate and concern. These are heavily regulated in just about every state in the United States. And this is exactly for these reasons. This is also kind of another really prime market for thinking about. This is a great application of behavioral economics techniques. Again, we think about incorrect beliefs. Do people really anticipate how much they'll revolve these loans? Are people taking them out because of lapses of self-control? Okay. I used to have slides in my undergraduate behavioral economics class. When I was talking about self-control, I would actually have payday lenders as an illustration, because I used to say, well, how could anyone possibly want to take out a loan at this high interest if it's not because of self-control problems? I stopped doing that. Because really there are actually good reasons for doing that. For a lot of these, the opposing part is, why might you do that? Well, you've exhausted all of your capital with your friends and family. Your car just broke down. And so your choice is either you can take out a loan for $300 that you'll revolve 5 times and end up paying back $600, or you don't have a car to get to work. That, unfortunately, is actually the reality for a number of people. But this is kind of what makes this an important policy evaluation question. How much of this borrowing behavior is due to factors that we would consider legitimate and important, which is you need to do what you got to do to get your car repaired and get to work? How much of it is about people effectively, A, not having correct beliefs about revolving this debt? Are people just wildly over-optimistic? They think they'll have a bigger payday than they actually will, and therefore they think they'll revolve this loan, 0 or once. Or how much of it is about self-control? So that's exactly what we did here to try to get at these kinds of issues, where we partnered with a payday lender. And it's funny, you might wonder, why would a payday lender ever allow us to do? We had a full contract. We had a legal agreement saying they cannot tell us what we can and can't publish. So why would they ever do that? We thought they were crazy. So we partnered with a payday lender. We intercepted people who just took out a loan with iPads, where we ran a survey and an experiment on the iPads that involved the following kind of 3 objects. One is we elicited their beliefs about revolving debt. 2 is we introduced, this is kind of the more external component, we effectively introduced this disincentive to revolve debt, which is if you're kind of debt-free, over this particular time period, then, several weeks after the end of this time period, we are going to give you a $100 reward. So it's a disincentive to borrow. We elicited their beliefs about this, what they would do with this disincentive to borrow, and this is the part that actually, through some quantitative exercises, allows us to estimate their perceived level of but not actual, but perceived level of self-control. How much do they value this disincentive? You know, the more you think that you worry about your future self being subject to temptation and revolving debt more often than you think your future self should, the higher is going to be your willingness to pay, and particularly your willingness to pay might be higher than your subjective perception of how much you would actually earn from this no borrowing incentive. Here, this was very humbling. Here is people's actual likelihood of revolving the next loan at 74%. Here's their forecast, 70%. I thought people were going to be way off. They're not. Why? Well, there's one group of people who are way off who have not really been to a payday lender before. Everyone who has done this before, if anything, you know, they might be getting kind of pessimistic. I mean, this is not statistically distinguishable from zero, so I would just call it a no. But you know, once you've gone through this extremely trying process, you become very realistic and kind of pessimistic. You know, and in fact, very quickly. And so, with these kinds of moments in hand, you know, what we try to do now is say, well, you know, we learned something about people in incorrect beliefs. We learned something about their levels of self-control. What can we say about policy? This is a very humbling case where we actually found there's very little room for intervening. And the most you can actually do to really align people's behavior with what's good for them is just to have a very light touch regulation in the form of a cooling off period, where if people kind of do this 3 times in a row, you kind of say, you got to take a break. No more taking out loans, but no evidence that anything as harsh as a ban or much tighter restrictions on borrowing could possibly help people. Yes?
You ask people about sort of like all the like car broken down and all the factors that just make self-control.
Yeah, no, this we couldn't do because, well, I mean, we didn't do because it had to be a very, very quick survey. Again, we're just really interested. These are people who want to get out, you know. They got their loan, they need to go. So, you know, and also not kind of the most financially literate segment of the population. So it was already a lot of work just to do the 3 elicitations that we did. But again, the way to think about the strategy here is we say, we're going to estimate what portion of borrowing is due to lapses of self-control or basically incorrect beliefs about what you're doing, including kind of your own personal naivete and misprediction about your levels of self-control. Any portion that's not explained by that, we're going to attribute to legitimate factors, and there are many of them. But you're right, it would be interesting to kind of additionally validate this with, you know, for people where we estimate larger portions being due to legitimate factors, are those also the people who list more of these kinds of things?
I guess it's going a little bit back to Rudy's question where I would think like most of the people just have no other choice for factors.
Yep. Yeah, and that's, I think, what we're discovering. You know, the real problem is, and the markups of payday lenders are not even that high because the loans are small. So, you know, $45 on the $300 loan feels like it's large in a proportional sense, but it's small in an absolute sense. And the problem with payday lending is it's brick and mortar. So the reason for these high fees is it's just an extremely inefficient business. And so really, if you know, the thing now I say is the policy solution is not to ban payday lenders. The policy solution is basically something like fintech, where you can provide liquidity to people at a much lower cost. Because this is brick and mortar lending is at this scale is just extraordinarily inefficient. Yes.
Well, okay, so I write this check that's for my next payday. Isn't it possible that there's not going to be enough money in my account to cover it, and I'm going to hit with additional fees?
Yeah, occasionally people default, you know, and sometimes you pay overdraft, you know, basically, you know, over withdrawal fees. There's also various forms of consumer protection that vary across states that kind of limit to what extent people pay additional fees. But yeah, you know, some of the time people also default. It's not quite as often as you might think. And again, where my intuition was wrong, that I later realized after I started looking at the numbers, I used to think that the fees were high because of a high default rate, but it's really not that. It's really just very plain, but it's a completely boring, and you would think solvable reason, which is just the inefficiency of brick and mortar lending. Yeah, this is, I thought this would be like a very like, hey, you know, behavioral biases are huge kind of a thing, but really it's, I think the real situation here is it's a very boring economic reason for why this is a bad business. Yeah. Yes?
So I think I heard you give a talk in Evans Hall about these data some years back when you were first collecting them. And I was worried about working with a payday lender. And you kind of said, well, I don't know why they want to do this. I think I know why they want to do this. And it kind of worries me. Like, do you think in hindsight that they use your data to extract just a little bit more lucre out of their clients? Or how does that work?
I don't know. I mean, we only have like a very boring academic paper, that's 100 pages long. So it's a little bit hard to go to town with something like that. We didn't kind of write policy brief. This one we did not. We've written kind of opinion pieces about soda tax. This one we didn't want to, in part because of we didn't want that research to be abused in a particular way. I think they basically, I can tell you they basically guessed these results. The reason they gave us access is because I think, it's tempting to think of them as the bad guys. I think of them less as bad guys after this research. I think they know their customers, and I think they were reasonably confident that this is what independent research would find. And kind of sitting with this data and kind of reading some more ethnographic accounts, people's attitudes toward debt and what life is really like, for that kind of low-income segment of the population. I kind of come to appreciate that, it's a lot of the decisions they make are more actions of desperation rather than, kind of what an ivory tower behavioral economist would say is self-control, stupidity. It's not so much that as, really just acts of desperation that also kind of color people's beliefs. Okay, let me turn to, there's lots of other work in the spirit, but let me kind of turn back to challenge 2 and what I think is missing. And let's think about finances. So in the financial domain, I've really focused on the role of things like lapses of self-control and incorrect beliefs. And, we look around at people's financial decisions and, and we often say, wow, there's so much room for improvement. Now you ask people, if you put more time into your financial decisions, do you think you can make better ones? And people say yes. So it's not really a case where people are confident that they're making the right decision and they just don't really realize they make the wrong one. The majority of people we asked would understand that if they just put a little bit more time into their financial decision, they would make better ones. And then we asked, and this is actually recoded open-ended responses, not priming people anything, just write about, big paragraph box, write about why you don't spend more time on financial planning. And the 2 things, we have things like self-control, like I procrastinate, you have something like, complexity aversion, you have something like a little bit of overconfidence, but that's very few respondents say this, it's futile. What are the prominent ones? It's actually anxiety, fear, stress, just a real sense of feeling overwhelmed. The kind of stuff that I just talked about, incorrect beliefs and self-control, it actually doesn't look like it's the biggest factor here. What are some other popular applications of behavioral economics and policy? Health. Talked about sugary drinks taxes. Many of us have worked on encouraging exercise. Should people spend more time figuring out the optimal nutrition and exercise routine? Yes. Everyone agrees that if they spent more time thinking about it, they would be healthier. Why don't people put more time into becoming healthier? Many of the same, some of it is plain economic reasons. Some people say, I don't have time. That feels like maybe more of a legitimate preference. But again, the emotional consequences of it's just a very stressful thing. You don't always want to reflect on how unhealthy you are. And that's a big part of it. The emotions that people experience with this kind of act of choosing, careers and labor supply, same kind of patterns. Okay, and so what does, coming back to challenge number 2, how can we incorporate these kinds of factors into our welfare analyses? The types of methods that I've talked about so far are not going to get there. This is a new challenge. This is not about mistakes. This is about what I was calling the non-comparability problem. Okay? One example that I already gave you, you can't really evaluate on the ban on soda correctly by just looking how much people are willing to pay for soda if the reason people are willing to pay for soda is because its presence exerts temptation. Because what if you remove that temptation? Then what would be, how much welfare loss is there? We don't actually know. People's choices have not revealed that. Okay? Or think about this other example. I'll go through this in more detail. Consider why people might share money. Think about like experimental dictator games or any kind of pro-social decision making. You might do it because you're altruistic, but you might do it because you would feel guilty not to. Okay? And then, can anything reveal that guilt that people are experiencing? Because a question we might ask is, what if we remove people's opportunity to give? How would that make them feel? Well, we don't know. How could we ever reveal that? Because imagine a person who says, I give out of guilt, but I really wish I never had that opportunity. Because, I actually want to keep all the money for myself, it's just I'm going to feel terrible if I don't share some of my money. It's impossible to reveal that with any kind of standard choice data. What choice could possibly reveal their desire to not have the opportunity? You might say, well, hey, do you want to give up your opportunity to give? But that's a completely circular approach, because if people are not willing to bear responsibility for giving nothing, they're also not going to fully, honestly reveal their desire to not be in a situation of not giving. That's a non-comparability problem. So what I can do as an experimenter, what a policymaker can do exogenously in terms of manipulating people's choice sets is fundamentally non-comparable to any kind of choice people actually have in front of them. Okay? So that's a limitation of kind of standard choice-based analysis, including the behavioral version, the kind of the behavioral economics version that I showed you before, where we still ultimately go off of people's choices. We just try to put them in situations where, the consequences of their actions are more transparent to them. Okay. Now here is where you might say, okay, well this is where subjective well-being, SWB data, enters, because maybe you might see this as a workaround, because you put people in a situation where you never gave them an opportunity to give, and you elicit their happiness or satisfaction. You put them in a situation where they do have an opportunity to give, and you elicit their happiness and satisfaction. That feels like it might resolve the issue in a way that choice-based data doesn't, but what does a happiness scale actually mean? Do I even choose things that make me happier? Who knows? So that's where some of these issues come in. So what we are trying to come up with here now is a hybrid approach that kind of borrows the best from both the choice-based tradition and the subjective well-being elicitation tradition. Like I said, non-choice data in principle circumvents this non-comparability problem, because you can just elicit how people feel in situations where they have an opportunity to give versus not. But there's a question again of like, is happiness the right thing? Is satisfaction the right thing? What about like the 10 other emotions that people feel that are associated with giving? And then if we elicit 10 different emotions, how do we aggregate them into a single measure of what's good or bad for someone? Okay, so that's kind of the challenge we're facing here, and this is kind of the object of this paper. So let me give you. I'm just going to do this illustration one more time, and I'll give you a sense of how it resolves. So again, here's the example. So we have Norma. She must choose how much of $10 to give to a friend. Norma is averse to bearing responsibility for leaving her friend with nothing when other options are available. So no matter how the task is framed, she's going to divide the money equally. Okay. However, she actually wishes someone would take the decision out of her hands and give her the entire prize. So what she would prefer is a choice set Y that simply has zero giving available. Okay. That's her true preference, but nothing can reveal that, because instead so this is a situation where Norma has preferences not just over outcomes, but over the choice sets. And the reason we can never learn preferences over the choice sets is because, all we ever see is how she chooses from a choice set. And you might say, well, what if we give her choices over choice sets? But that's just another choice set, which is context dependent, and none of those choice sets is actually going to be the same as she simply has no ability to give. Okay, so there's kind of a formal version of this that's basically saying, once you fully formalize this, it's basically saying that when people exhibit these kinds of choice-based or menu-based preferences, you actually cannot ever, there's nothing you could ever do to recover their preferences with standard choice data. Okay, that's a formal result. So what's the approach? The approach is to talk about a difference, is to remap these consumption bundles, what I get, what the other person gets, the soda and so forth, to actually bundles of mental states. Every choice I have in front of me, just think of it as actually a bundle of a bunch of different emotions. Guilt, anxiety, pride. If I don't give anything, I might feel a lot of guilt. But I might have very high financial satisfaction. I might not feel any fairness, and so forth. If I share, I might have a high sense of fairness and pride. I will feel very little financial satisfaction. And so the approach is as follows. For every option people are facing, we're going to ask them themselves to map it to a bundle of mental states like this. If you choose this, how much would you experience these different types of sensations? If you choose this other thing, how much would you experience these other sensations? So now we have a mapping from every choice people are facing to their subjectively perceived bundle of mental states. Okay? Now what do we do with these bundles? This bundle itself is not a measure of well-being because we don't know how much people care about guilt versus pride versus financial satisfaction. How do people trade these off? We need to know these trade-offs to actually figure out how well off someone's going to be if we just remove their opportunity to share, or if we remove the bottle of soda pop in front of them. Okay? So this is where the choice-based data comes in. If we map people's options to the choices they face, and then we see what people ultimately choose, then now we're back to reveal preference. We're revealing their preferences over bundles of sensations. And so people's choices themselves then tell us what they care about more. If people constantly give very different ratings of pride to different options, but we see that differences in pride never relate to what people choose, they don't help predict what people choose, we infer from that people don't put that much weight on pride. Okay? That's the basic idea. So then, after the step, once you have the different weights, now you're actually in great shape, because now for any exogenously imposed situation that people can't quite reveal normal preferences over, like when we put people in a situation where we can't share, we elicit these proxies again. We have the weights from other choice data, so we know how to aggregate all of these different sensations to generate a single index of well-being. So that's roughly the approach. Let me kind of quickly take you through how it works. So we're doing this in so again, the goal is to kind of really build this out and kind of come back to the kinds of policy questions that I was starting to talk with. Here we're really doing this in a very, very simple controlled situation, but one where people have previously suggested that preferences over menus could teach us a lot about preferences. So we're just talking about very simple pro-social kind of environments, dictator games, and these kind of modified versions where you don't just play a dictator game, but first you're asked, do you want to be part of this dictator game or not? Okay? And we elicit subjective. So here's an example. Here's a standard dictator game choice. What do you want to, you and your partner each get $2, or you get $3 and your partner gets 0. That's kind of one of the 7 choices that people made. And following this, we have these elicitations. So considering both how you feel now and how you might feel in the future, please indicate to what extent that your decision letter will lead you to experience the following. Where did we come up with these? This was just kind of we did our best to kind of learn the literature on the psychology of pro-social emotions to kind of try to get a sense of what are the potentially relevant sensations that people might have in this situation. Okay, so they give us this evaluation. They give this both for the choice they made and for the choice they didn't make. We ask, how would you have felt if you have made the other choice? Okay, so these are kind of our elicitations, and we call these categorical subjective assessments. They're not exactly mental state bundles, because who knows exactly what the relevant mental state is, but the hope is that the elicitations the things that we are eliciting here are kind of spanning the relevant space of mental state bundles. Yes?
Just a real quick question. Why did you decide to separate the now and the future? Because it almost comes from some of the things you've been saying might have second thoughts or,
Yeah.
the things like guilt and.
No, that's a great question. Yeah, we struggled a lot with this one, and it comes to the following. So we worry a lot about the aggregation problem. How do you aggregate across a set of this, kind of very different types of sensations? Right, that's one form of aggregation, but another form of aggregation is how do you aggregate over experiences from different points in time, right? And so actually we have a separate module where we don't kind of ask people to internally aggregate about now and the future, but we ask, how do you think you'll feel now? How do you think you'll feel in the future? And we look at how closely related those are, and if we disaggregate them, do we kind of get anything different than when we just ask a single aggregate question? There the answer was no. I don't think that's a general result at all. I think one of the big, Doug Bernheim worries about this much more than I do, in part because he's just spent more time thinking about this, but kind of one of the big challenges of using subjective well-being data is exactly this ambiguity. When you ask me how happy I am I talking about how happy I feel now? Am I incorporating some kind of anticipation of what I'll do? So intertemporal aggregation is a very tricky one. In principle, you could apply the same method I'm showing you here to aggregate intertemporally, not just across different types of experiences. But I think it's a very important issue, for sure.
And you know this, I'm sure, but there's a literature on how people take temporal data like that.
Yep.
They aggregate and they say what I felt, is influenced by how they felt at the end and how they felt at the peak moment. That's sort of the finding of that literature. So,
Yep. You're talking about like the pecan rule studies or a different? Okay. Yeah.
And I don't think in any way, it may not even be relevant here.
Yeah, I think there's a question about can people correctly anticipate their sensations in counterfactual situations. That we also have a test for, because we have versions where we first ask people to predict how they'll feel, versus a module where we have people say how they feel after they make the choice. So we vary whether the elicitations come before or after. In our particular, again, I don't think that's general at all. In our particular case, things like magically lined up, and we found no difference, so we're more comfortable, about using elicitations for counterfactual choices. I think in a lot of other applications, this would be a much bigger problem, than we need to find other ways of overcoming it. In this particular setting, it magically was not an issue. Yeah. Let me just quickly, since I'm running, let me try to make a little bit more progress here. So that's one version. Here's the computer choice version, and again, this gets at this whole issue of non-comparability problem. So, what if you simply had an exogenous allocation? How would people feel in this kind of situation? To what extent could choice data accurately capture this? Okay. And again, we followed this with the same kind of elicitation, because that's our way of capturing how people would feel in this situation where they don't get a choice, but we still need to find some way of how they would feel about the situation. And third, here's the opt-out game. So here we say you can either opt in and choose one of these allocations. So this says you can choose to play this game, or you can opt out and receive $5. Okay? If you opt out, the individual you would have been paired with will not be told anything about this allocation task. Okay? And will simply be paid, this was on MTurk before it was swarmed with bots. You will be paid the hit fee without a bonus. This has been a very popular approach in the literature. There's a reason we have this game, we have a little bit of a critique here, because the previous suggestion, at least in the behavioral economics literature, is that, well, if you really want to learn about whether people share out of guilt, or out of altruism, give people these kinds of options. And the implicit assumption in all of this literature here is that all of these issues around guilt and anxiety and so forth, while they're prevalent in when you choose between these two options, you're completely guilt-free if you choose to opt out. Why? I don't know. That was kind of our concern, why you would think that all of these factors would be present in the dictator game itself, but not in the choice to opt out. And that's exactly what our approach can both, it can both eliminate the need to make this assumption, and it can perhaps more constructively test whether that assumption was valid or not. Okay? And same kinds of thing, and then a bunch of robustness checks, and let me skip. Okay. So basically, as I was saying, so what can we do now? We can run a regression of what people choose, whether people choose the more equitable allocation or the more self-serving one on the differences in sensations that people have. That's all that the slide is saying. We're just going to run that regression, and when you run that regression, okay, here's kind of what you get. Okay, and these are, you can think of as the weight. So it kind of all goes in the direction you expect. If one option generates more guilt than another, you're less likely to choose it. Pride here, it's actually incidentally not that important. Financial satisfaction, positive, you try to avoid feelings of unfairness. We had these two different things because it looked like the literature was saying that you have to separate between positive and negative valence sensations, so we kind of had fairness and unfairness separately here. And here are the aggregator emotions, happiness and satisfaction. This was of particular interest to us because, prior to us writing this paper, a lot of people were telling us, what are you worried about? Just use a happiness scale. Easy. Why are you worrying about all of this other, there's already a solution in the literature, just ask a happiness scale. But the result one that we have is you can have a happiness scale, you can even have a satisfaction scale, but they're not fully capturing all relevant aspects of people's emotions. They're capturing some, because if you remove the happiness and satisfaction, you can see that the coefficients on these other things change. So why is the coefficient on pride here 0? It's basically absorbed in some measure of these aggregators, happiness or satisfaction. Once you remove them from the regression, the magnitudes here are all much higher. So clearly these aggregators are capturing some of these other disaggregated emotional states, but not completely.
If you remove the others and you look at happiness and satisfaction,
those coefficients will also get bigger, right? Because they're all related, but this is kind of our approach of saying we're just going to let people's choices tell us what they actually care about, and this is kind of the answer. Okay, so now from this we can basically construct an index. We can also do the thing that probably is irrelevant to most folks in this room, but warms a lot of economists' hearts, which is instead of just using an index where we take all of these different sensations and we take their weighted average via these coefficients, we can convert it to money metric units. Okay, where we can say that a one standard, for example, a 1 unit change in this index is the same thing as you getting an extra $1, or the same thing as you getting an extra $1. Again, for this kind of exercise, it's not that useful exactly to have this index, although you'll see how it can make some results more apparent. But once we start thinking about kind of larger kind of economic aggregation problems where other things like damages and regressivity is measured in money units, you also want to have a way of going from this well-being index to these other commonly used units. Okay, lots of robustness checks. Let me show you one which was amazingly worked out. One thing you might worry about is stability of people's preferences over these emotions. Like our presumption by moving to this mental statist approach is that people's preferences are stable. There's an empirical test of that you can run. So what we did here is we estimated people's preferences not on the dictator games, but on these opt-out games where people had 3 choices. So it's like a specification test. We take those estimated preferences, and then we apply them to the emotions that people give us in the dictator games, and we form a prediction of what people will choose in the dictator game. So it's like a partial out of sample test because the weights come from the opt-out games from a different game. And then we see how well they line up. And it's actually perfect. Like I made the graduate student, I made her triple check this. I went into the data because this actually looks a little bit too good to be true. So I got a little anxious, but it's a 45-degree line. So you can estimate preferences from a different type of game, and you can use that to predict what's going to happen to choice in one game. So that's the kind of stability thing that kind of really made me feel more comfortable with methodology. So from this, you can kind of get some standard result. You can see how, people's utility, and this is in money metric terms, this is where it's useful. How do you feel about choosing the more self-serving options? Do you get $4 worth of utility from that? No, you get less than $4. So you immediately see how some pro-social decision-making is driven by the avoidance of negativity. You feel bad, okay? But it's not all about avoidance of negative sensations. You can also see in the aggregate, once we have these money metrics, how it's also about feeling good. Because how much utility do people get when they choose, in the blue, this equitable allocation? So looking at this example here, which is 2-2, you get way more than $2 of utility. So it's not just about avoiding the negative, it's also about experiencing the positive when you choose pro-socially. So that you can immediately kind of read out from this methodology. It's very hard to discover that from choice data alone. Okay. You can also, here's the first demonstration of the non-comparability problem, just to kind of like start tying this together. You can ask the following question now with these methods in place. How often do people prefer more equitable options in the dictator games versus if these same options were assigned exogenously by the computer, how often would they prefer the more equitable one when it's exogenously assigned? Okay, again, you can't make that comparison with choice data because by definition exogenous means unchosen, but you can do that with our method, and here's result 4, here's the answer. On average, people prefer the more equitable option about 10% of the time more when they're choosing than when it's exogenously assigned, and so that's the non-comparability problem right there. Okay, it's just fundamentally non-comparable. Just because you choose the more equitable option yourself doesn't mean that you would prefer the more equitable one to be exogenously assigned to you. Okay? So you can read that off right there. So this is kind of the first method in place. And now you can look at just the last bit on opting out. So do people experience any negative emotions when they opt out? They do. Okay, so the red here is the opt-out option. And when you choose to opt out and just get $5, you don't get $5 of utility, you get less than that. And that's true in any of the games. So right there we can say, you know what? These prior approaches of simply looking at the opt-out decisions were missing something important because the same emotions people experience in just the choice between equitable and more equitable, they also experience in the opt-out decisions. Just not as intensely. Okay? And then you kind of run it through. I'm not going to go through this complicated table, basically showing that if you use kind of the older approach of just kind of pricing out people's utility to play in this game by varying the opt-out option, you just come to wrong conclusions, and it's just a manifestation of what I'm talking about here. So let me just, I'm over time, so thank you for your patience. Let me just conclude here. So, what I talked about is kind of interesting applications of behavioral economics to questions about welfare and public policy. We've done a lot of work on mistakes. I don't think we've done nearly enough work on this important idea that the act of choosing itself can produce very strong welfare-relevant emotion, and in particular, fundamentally make the choices people make themselves non-comparable to the kind of choices that policymakers and regulators have, but we think we have an approach that might be helpful in kind of starting to chip away at some of these issues. Thank you all so much for the wonderful questions and attention. This was a lot of fun.